The chalk mark was a ghost against the iron skin of the postbox. A faint smear of lapis lazuli, no bigger than a thumbnail, almost entirely lost against the gray, lichen-spotted Victorian metalwork. To any of the dog walkers or late-afternoon strollers cutting through the skeletal beauty of Regent's Park, it was a child's idle scribble, a meaningless stain. To Dr. Alistair Finch, it was a flared match in a powder magazine. It was a death sentence and a prayer all at once. His heart, a frantic starling trapped in the cage of his ribs, hammered a panicked, syncopated rhythm against his sternum. His hand, slick with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the damp November air, tightened on the worn calfskin handle of his briefcase, a gift from his late wife, Eleanor. The leather felt impossibly thin, a flimsy shield against the world he now inhabited. Blue meant the drop was active. Blue meant the wolves were hungry. Blue meant he was waiting. Alistair forced his legs to move, to carry him onward in the measured, thoughtful stride of a man of academia. He fixed his gaze on the skeletal branches of the plane trees ahead, their mottled bark like the skin of a dying beast. He was a man of science, a creature of logic and predictable outcomes. His life, until recently, had been governed by the immutable laws of physics, the elegant certainty of Fourier transforms and Bayesian probability. Or it had been. Now, it was governed by the color of chalk and the silent, terrifying grammar of espionage. He was a senior physicist at the Admiralty Research Establishment in Portland, his mind a finely tuned instrument for unraveling the complexities of sound propagation in deep, cold water. He could trace the acoustic signature of a Soviet Alpha-class submarine from 100 miles away. Yet now, that same mind was hopelessly tangled in a web of paranoia and deceit spun by men he had never truly seen. He completed the prescribed circuit of the inner circle, a 30-minute walk he'd performed a dozen times before. Each step a dry rehearsal for this suffocating premiere. He checked for tails, not with the practiced, fluid ease of a trained agent, but with the clumsy, terrified diligence of an amateur aping a professional. He had memorized the pamphlets they had given him, the thin, onion-skin pages filled with diagrams and instructions that felt like they were printed in a language from another planet. He used the plate glass window of a closed cafe as a mirror, his reflection a pale, haunted stranger staring back at him. He paused to tie a shoelace he knew was perfectly knotted, the damp chill of the pavement seeping through the knee of his trousers, his head bowed to scan the path behind him. Near the boating lake, where the last of the pedalos were being chained up for the winter, he abruptly reversed his direction, his breath catching in his throat as he scanned the faces of the few strangers braving the encroaching dusk. He saw no one familiar, no one paying him undue attention. There was a young woman in a trench coat, her face buried in a book. An elderly man throwing breadcrumbs to a flock of pigeons that descended with a greedy, flapping roar. But the absence of a visible threat was not the same as the presence of safety. He knew that now, with a certainty that chilled him more than the wind. The most dangerous enemies were the ones you never saw, the ghosts in the machine. The drop point was a specific bench, one of 10 identical green-painted benches overlooking the Queen Mary's Rose Garden, now a bleak, architectural collection of thorny, naked stems. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. As instructed, he sat at the far right end, the cold iron seeping through his wool coat. He placed his briefcase on the damp wooden slats beside him. He opened it, the brass latches clicking with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire park. Ostensibly, he was checking his papers, but his trembling fingers, clumsy as sausages, went to a false bottom he had painstakingly installed himself in his workshop. his skills with precision tools finally put to a use that made his stomach churn with a viscous self-loathing. Inside the hidden compartment lay a single postcard of the Tower of London, its colors garishly cheerful against the gloom of the evening. It was addressed to a fictitious Aunt Mildred in a non-existent cottage in Dorset. The stamp, a common machine-head definitive, was the key. Affixed to its underside, so small it was almost invisible to the naked eye, was a microdot. It had taken him 4 hours in his cellar darkroom, the acrid smell of developer fluid and fixer mingling with the scent of damp earth, to produce this tiny speck of treason. It contained high-resolution photographs of 12 pages of technical schematics. They were the core specifications for Project Proteus, the Royal Navy's next-generation submarine sonar baffling system. It was his life's work, a system of active acoustic cancellation designed to make a hunter-killer submarine disappear to render it a ghost in the cold, dark depths of the North Atlantic. And he was giving it away. He took out the postcard and his Parker 51 fountain pen, its nib a familiar comfort. He pretended to write, his hand shaking so violently the nib scratched and tore at the glossy surface. Dear Aunt Mildred, London is dreary as ever, but work is progressing well. The banality of the lie was a physical sickness in his throat. Work was not progressing. Work was being hollowed out, its soul siphoned away by a man who had never seen the inside of his laboratory. 5 minutes passed, an eternity measured in heartbeats. A groundskeeper pushed a squeaking barrow of dead leaves nearby, the rhythmic squeak of its unoiled wheel an agonizing torment on Alistair's frayed nerves. A young couple huddled together on a distant bench, their shared laughter echoing unnaturally in the cold, still air, a sound from a different, happier world. Alistair's gaze kept flicking to the path. The instructions had been crystal clear. The contact would not acknowledge him. He would be a man of middle age, walking a small dog, wearing a gray tweed coat. He would sit on the same bench, but at the opposite end. He would open a newspaper. That was the signal. Then he saw him. The silhouette emerged from the dusk. Gray tweed coat, a small, scruffy terrier straining at its leash, letting out a series of sharp, excited yaps. The man was utterly nondescript, a face you would forget the moment you looked away. A perfect specimen of the London commuter class. He approached the bench. Alistair's blood turned to ice water in his veins. The man sat. The dog immediately began sniffing at the base of the bench. The rustle of a newspaper, a copy of the Financial Times, being unfolded, was like a gunshot in the silent park. It was happening. Alistair stood up, his legs feeling weak and disconnected, like a marionette's. As per the protocol, he left the postcard on the bench, seemingly forgotten. He walked away without a backward glance, each step a monumental act of will. He did not look back. To look back was to show fear, to show attachment. It was to break the rules. He walked for 50 paces, counting each one in his head like a rosary bead. 1, 2, 3. He turned left onto the main path leading towards Baker Street. Only then, shielded by the trunk of a large chestnut tree, did he allow himself the briefest, most fleeting glance over his shoulder. The man was gone. The postcard was gone. The transaction was complete. The relief that washed over him was so profound, so absolute, it almost brought him to his knees. It was followed, instantly, by a wave of nausea and shame so powerful he had to grip a cold iron railing to steady himself. He had just committed treason. He had sold out his country, his colleagues, the young men who would serve on those submarines, everything he had once believed in. And he knew, with a certainty that was as absolute as any physical law, that he would do it again tomorrow if they asked, because the price of his betrayal was the life of his son. It had started 6 months ago, not in a shadowy alleyway, but in a quiet tea room in Kensington, a place of chintz curtains and the gentle clink of silver on bone china. The man had introduced himself as Mr. Petrov, a cultural attaché from the Soviet embassy. He was charming, urbane, with a flawless command of English that was tinged with only the faintest, most melodic hint of his origins. He smelled of expensive cologne and, faintly, of strong, unfiltered cigarettes. He claimed to be an admirer of Alistair's published academic work from his Cambridge days. They talked for an hour about acoustic physics, about the strange beauty of cymatics, the visualization of sound. It was all so pleasant, so civilized. Alistair, a lonely man since Eleanor's death 2 years prior, was flattered by the intelligent, engaging attention. The second meeting was in a grimy pub near Waterloo, the Anchor and Crown, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and fried onions. The tone shifted. Petrov, or Orlov, as he now called himself, dropped the pretense of academic curiosity. He knew where Alistair worked, he knew the classified nature of his research. And he knew about Thomas. Thomas, Alistair's son, his brilliant, beautiful boy, who had once been destined for a mathematics fellowship at Trinity, who could see the world in patterns and numbers that Alistair himself could barely comprehend, and who now, at 22, resided in Blackwood Manor, a private psychiatric hospital nestled in the Surrey countryside, a place of hushed corridors, manicured lawns, and locked doors. Thomas's brilliant mind had fractured, broken apart by the relentless siege of paranoid schizophrenia. The voices he heard were his constant companions, whispering of conspiracies and threats that were invisible to everyone else. Orlov had laid a photograph on the sticky pub table. It was of Thomas, taken with a long lens, sitting on a bench in the gardens of Blackwood Manor. He was painfully thin, his face pale, his eyes wide with a familiar, hunted look that tore at Alistair's soul. He looked so vulnerable, so alone. "A fine facility," Orlov had said, his voice a soft, reasonable purr. "Expensive, and very well regarded. But the National Health Service has less comfortable institutions, places for the truly disruptive, the violent, overcrowded, understaffed, a sensitive boy like Thomas. I do not think he would fare well in such an environment." The threat was unspoken, but it hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating as the pub's smoke. A word from the right person, a complaint filed by a concerned citizen about a non-existent incident, a suggestion to the review board that Thomas's condition was deteriorating, that he required a more secure facility. It would be so easy to manipulate the lumbering bureaucracy of the system, to have him transferred from the gentle sanctuary of Blackwood to a place that was little more than a prison, a place that would utterly break what was left of his fragile mind. "What do you want?" Alistair had whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Cooperation," Orlov replied, sliding the photograph back into his coat pocket. "You help us understand the ocean song, Doctor. And we, in turn, will ensure your son continues to receive the very best of care. We will even contribute to his expenses, anonymously, of course. We are not monsters, Dr. Finch. We are pragmatists, and we understand, above all else, the love a father has for his son." And so it began. The first delivery was simple, a test of compliance, a publicly available research paper he had authored years ago. Then came the requests for more, technical specifications, performance data, each request escalating, pulling him deeper and deeper into the mire. He learned the tradecraft from those onion skin pamphlets. How to create a microdot using a Minox B camera, a marvel of German engineering no bigger than his thumb, disguised as a luxury lighter. Its tiny, precise click was the soundtrack to his damnation. He learned about dead drops, live drops, brush passes. He learned the Canterbury Bell system, a series of chalk marks on that specific Regent's Park postbox. A silent, coded dialogue with his handler. Blue for an active drop. Red for an abort, danger. Yellow for an emergency face-to-face meeting. White for a package waiting for him. He had seen the white mark twice. The first time, it led him to a hollowed-out copy of Jane Eyre in a public library containing the Minox camera. The second time, to a small, thick envelope with £5,000 in used 20-pound notes, tucked behind a loose brick in a churchyard wall. The money felt filthy, tainted. He donated it all, anonymously, to a children's hospital. He couldn't bear to spend a single penny of his Judas money. His life fractured into a series of carefully managed compartments. There was Alistair the scientist, who drove his Rover 3500 to the high-security facility in Portland each day, passing through multiple checkpoints and exchanging pleasantries with colleagues, all while feeling like a walking fraud. His mind, once consumed by the pure, intellectual challenge of his work, was now constantly assessing risk, calculating angles, searching for the best way to steal the very secrets he was paid to protect. He'd become an expert at palming documents, at using the brief moments alone in the archives to photograph pages with the tiny camera. Then there was Alistair the father. Every Sunday, he would make the long drive down to Surrey to visit Thomas. These visits were the source of his torment and the sole justification for his treason. He would sit with his son in the sterile, pastel-colored common room, trying to breach the walls of his illness. Sometimes, Thomas was lucid, and they would talk of mathematics and stars. And for a few precious minutes, Alistair would see a glimpse of the brilliant boy he had lost. But more often, Thomas was lost in his own terrifying world, whispering about the signals and the static on the radio, the men who watched him from the trees. They're broadcasting on 4.625 megahertz, Dad. Thomas would whisper, his eyes wide, gripping Alistair's arm with surprising strength. It's the buzzer. They're sending me instructions. They want my thoughts. The irony was a blade twisting in Alistair's gut. His son, persecuted by imaginary spies, transmitting on the frequency of a real number station, while he, the father, was being controlled by real ones. He would soothe Thomas, tell him he was safe, that no one would hurt him, the words turning to ash in his mouth. Each lie he told his son was a reflection of the greater lie he was living. And finally, there was Alistair the spy. This was the man who walked the streets of London in a cold sweat, who memorized train timetables and bus routes, who practiced surveillance detection runs on his way to the grocer. The man who sat in his cellar under a dim red safe light, his hands shaking as he developed the incriminating film, his heart pounding with the fear of a siren in the distance, the knock on the door that would mean the end of everything. The pressure was becoming immense. At work, a new head of internal security had been appointed, a man named Davies. He was a quiet, unassuming man with watery gray eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had a habit of appearing unexpectedly in labs and offices, asking gentle, probing questions. Alistair felt Davies's eyes on him during meetings. He imagined he saw him in the facility's canteen, watching him from a distant table. Paranoia, he told himself, was a professional hazard. But his son's illness had taught him that paranoia was often just a heightened state of awareness. One evening, Leaving the facility, he saw a gray Ford Cortina parked 100 yards down the road. It was there the next day, and the day after. He started taking different routes home, winding through the back streets of Poole before getting on the motorway to London. The Cortina was always there, keeping a steady, professional distance. He was being watched. MI5. It had to be. The next chalk mark he saw was red. Abort. Danger. For 2 agonizing weeks, there was nothing. The silence was worse than the contact. It was a screaming void of uncertainty. Had he been compromised? Had Orloff abandoned him? Was Davies just gathering more evidence before making the arrest? He barely slept, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, every car that slowed on his street. He lost weight. His colleagues commented on his haggard appearance. He snapped at a junior physicist, a good lad named Peterson, for a minor error in a calculation, his reaction so disproportionate it drew shocked stares from everyone in the lab. He felt himself unraveling at the seams. Then, a white mark appeared. Package waiting. He found it in the designated spot, a locker at Charing Cross Station. Inside a tattered copy of Moby Dick was a new set of instructions and a key. The instructions were simple and terrifying. The game had changed. No more microdots. They wanted something physical. A prototype Proteus TD7 transducer disc. It was a ceramic and niobium composite plate, the size of a dinner plate and weighing nearly 10 pounds, the very heart of the acoustic baffling system. Stealing documents was one thing. Walking out of a top-secret naval research facility with a piece of classified hardware was another. It was impossible. It was suicidal. He went to the emergency meeting point, a bench in the farthest corner of Battersea Park. Orloff was there, feeding pigeons from a paper bag. He didn't look up as Alistair approached, his shoes crunching on the gravel. "It's impossible," Alistair said, his voice a choked whisper. "The security, the inventory controls, the radiation scanners at the gate. I can't just walk out with it." "You are a clever man, Doctor," Orloff said calmly, scattering another handful of breadcrumbs. The pigeons descended in a frantic, cooing mass of gray and iridescent feathers. "You will find a way. You must. And if I don't? If I can't?" Orloff finally turned to look at him. His eyes were flat and cold, like chips of granite. He reached into his coat and pulled out another photograph. This one was different. It wasn't of Thomas. It was a picture of a bleak, imposing Victorian building with barred windows and a high fence topped with razor wire. Alistair recognized it instantly. Rampton Secure Hospital. "Your son had an episode last week," Orloff said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "An altercation with an orderly. No real harm done. But a report was filed. These things, they add up. A pattern of escalating behavior. The review board meets in 1 month. I'm sure they will make the appropriate recommendation if another, perhaps more serious, incident were to occur." Alistair felt the blood drain from his face. They had manufactured an incident. They were tightening the noose, pulling it closed around his neck. "You have 3 weeks," Orloff said, standing up and dusting the crumbs from his coat. "Find a way, Doctor, for Thomas's sake." The next 3 weeks were a blur of frantic, desperate planning. Alistair studied the security protocols, the shift changes of the guards, the inventory logs. He was looking for a loophole, a crack in the system just wide enough for him to slip through. He found it in the quarterly calibration schedule. The transducer prototypes were periodically taken to a special anechoic chamber for recalibration. They were signed out of the main lab, transported across the facility, and signed in at the chamber. The paperwork was meticulous, but the physical transport was done by lab technicians. not security guards. For a brief window of maybe 15 minutes, the device would be vulnerable. His plan was audacious, born of sheer, sweat-soaked desperation. He would use his authority to schedule an unscheduled calibration for the transducer, citing a data anomaly he would fabricate himself. He would sign it out, but instead of taking it to the chamber, he would take it to his own office. He had already acquired a briefcase with a specially constructed lead-lined interior, telling the requisitions department it was for transporting sensitive magnetic media. It would serve to block any potential tracking signatures from the device. The most difficult part would be getting it past the gate. All bags were subject to random searches. It would come down to pure, dumb luck. The night before, he couldn't sleep. He sat in his silent house, a glass of Talisker in his hand, staring at a photograph of Eleanor, taken a year before the cancer took her. What would she think of him now? The man she had married, a man of integrity and principle, was now a common thief and a traitor. He was desecrating her memory, his own life, everything they had built. He thought of his oath, the Official Secrets Act he had signed, and the quiet pride he had once felt serving his country. It all felt like a lifetime ago. He drained the glass, the peaty burn of the spirit doing nothing to numb the ache in his soul. The day of the theft was gray and drizzling, the sky the color of unpolished lead. Every step of his plan worked with a terrifying, frictionless smoothness. He fabricated the data anomaly. He scheduled the calibration. He signed out the heavy transducer, its cool, smooth surface feeling like a block of sin in his hands. No one questioned him. He was Dr. Finch, head of the acoustic division, a man beyond suspicion. He walked back to his office, the heavy disc concealed in a standard lab transport case, his heart pounding a frantic tattoo against his ribs. In his office, with the door locked, he transferred the transducer to his lead-lined briefcase. He then spent an agonizing hour doctoring the calibration chamber's logs, creating a phantom record of the test he had never performed. It was a clumsy forgery, one that would never hold up to close scrutiny. But he just needed it to hold for a few hours. The walk from his office to the car park was the longest of his life. The briefcase felt impossibly heavy, pulling at the muscles in his shoulder. He approached the main gate, his mouth as dry as sand. He could see the two security guards in their glass booth. One was a burly man named George, whom he'd known for years. The other was a younger man he didn't recognize. There was a sign, "Random vehicle searches in operation. Please be prepared to stop." He put his rover in gear and rolled forward. He held his security pass up to the window, his hand trembling. George looked up, saw him, and smiled. "Nasty one out there, Doc," he said through the intercom. "Drive safe." He pressed the button to raise the barrier. He didn't even glance at the younger guard. He just waved him through. Alistair drove out of the facility, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He didn't allow himself to breathe until he was a mile down the road. He had done it. He had stolen a piece of the nation's most sensitive military technology. The drop was scheduled for that night. It was to be a brush pass at Waterloo Station during the evening rush hour. The instructions were precise. He was to carry the briefcase in his left hand. He would take the main escalator up to the concourse at exactly 1850. The contact would be coming down the adjacent escalator. A man in a dark blue raincoat carrying an identical briefcase in his right hand. As they passed, they would swap. Simple, elegant, and incredibly risky. Waterloo Station was a chaotic symphony of noise and motion. The roar of arriving trains, the echoing, disembodied voice of the announcer, the tramp and chatter of thousands of commuters. Alistair felt anonymous in the crowd, a single drop of water in a raging river. But he also felt hideously exposed, as if a spotlight was following his every move. And then he saw him. Standing by a W.H. Smith newsstand, half hidden behind a copy of the Evening Standard, was Davies. The same watery gray eyes, the same unassuming posture. He was watching the escalators. Panic, cold and sharp as a shard of glass, seized Alistair. It was a trap. They knew. They had been waiting for him to make his final move. His first instinct was to run, to disappear into the crowd, to throw the briefcase onto the tracks. But then he thought of Thomas. He thought of the bleak, barred windows of Rampton. He had no choice. He had to walk into the snare. He checked his watch. 18:49. 1 minute to go. He stepped onto the escalator, his left hand gripping the handle of the briefcase. The metal teeth of the steps slotted into place, and he began his slow, mechanical ascent. The noise of the station seemed to fade, replaced by the thundering of his own blood in his ears. He scanned the faces on the descending escalator, a sea of tired, blank expressions. Then he saw him. Dark blue raincoat, identical briefcase held in his right hand. The man's face was pale and set, his eyes fixed straight ahead, seeing nothing. They were drawing level. 10 feet, 5. Alistair's arm tensed. The man's arm moved in perfect rehearsed synchronicity. In the single second they were side by side, a fleeting, intimate moment of shared conspiracy in the swirling chaos of the station. Their hands moved as one. Alistair released his grip as he felt the cool plastic of the other handle press into his palm. It was done. A seamless, silent exchange. He reached the top of the escalator and stepped onto the concourse. He did not look back. He walked, forcing himself into a steady, unhurried pace, heading for the exit onto Waterloo Road. He felt a hand on his shoulder. "Dr. Finch?" A quiet voice said. "Could you spare a moment? My name is Davies." It was over. A strange, hollow sense of calm descended upon Alistair. The end of the lies. The end of the fear. 2 other men, broad-shouldered and grim-faced, materialized at Davies's side. They gently, but with an irresistible firmness, guided him towards a side office marked Station Master. The room was small and bare, smelling of stale coffee and disinfectant. A single fluorescent tube on the ceiling hummed and flickered. Davies sat opposite him at a metal table. He was polite, almost gentle. He didn't raise his voice. He simply laid out the facts, calmly and methodically. They had been watching him for months. They had bugged his phone. They had a team observing his house. They knew about the dead drops, the chalk marks, the meetings with Orloff. "We recovered the transducer, of course," Davies said, folding his hands on the table. His nails were immaculately clean. "Your contact was intercepted the moment he stepped off the escalator." Alistair said nothing. He stared at the scuffed linoleum floor. He was waiting for the questions about his motivation, the moment he would have to explain about Thomas. He was trying to formulate the words, to plead his case, to make them understand the impossible choice he had faced. "It was a very elegant operation, Alistair," Davies continued, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing a chess problem. "The KGB were desperate to get a man inside your research division. When they couldn't, they looked for another way in, a vulnerability. And they found you, a loyal, brilliant man in an impossible situation. The perfect target." Alistair looked up, a flicker of confusion cutting through his numb resignation. This wasn't the interrogation he was expecting. "The thing is," Davies said, leaning forward slightly, his gray eyes searching Alistair's, "we've been trying to get a man, inside their London residentura for years. A high-level penetration. Someone they would trust implicitly. But they're cautious. To be accepted, our man had to come bearing a gift, something of immense value, something they desperately wanted. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The humming of the fluorescent light grew louder. Alistair stared at Davies, the meaning of his words slowly dawning, a horrifying, sickening realization blooming in the pit of his stomach. "The man on the escalator?" Alistair whispered, his voice barely audible. "The man in the blue raincoat is one of ours," Davies finished quietly. "His name is Michael, and thanks to you, he just handed the KGB's London station chief a working prototype of the Proteus transducer. It's the most valuable piece of intelligence they've received in a decade. It authenticates him beyond any doubt. He's in. We've been running this operation for almost a year. We just had to wait for Orlov to choose the right asset to activate." Alistair felt the air leave his lungs in a silent gasp. He had not just been a traitor. He had been a pawn, a tool. His treason, his agonizing moral torment, his sleepless nights, his self-loathing, it had all been part of a plan orchestrated not just by the KGB, but by his own side. They had watched him being recruited. They had watched him being blackmailed, and they had let it happen. They had used his pain, his love, his fear, as currency. "My son," Alistair said, his voice cracking. "Thomas. They threatened my son." Davies's expression softened, a flicker of something that might have been pity in his eyes. "Yes, we know. Orlov is very good at what he does. He finds a weakness, and he presses on it until it breaks." "You knew? You knew they were threatening him?" "We had our suspicions," Davies admitted coolly. "It's their standard playbook." "And you did nothing?" The question was a cry of pure, uncomprehending anguish. "You let them torture me? You let me betray everything I believe in?" "The mission required it," Davies said, his voice hardening again, the civil servant replacing the man. Michael's placement was of the utmost strategic importance to national security. Sometimes, in our line of work, sacrifices have to be made for the greater good. The greater good. The phrase echoed in the small, bare room. Alistair felt a bitter, hysterical laugh building in his chest. He thought of his life's work, now in the hands of the enemy. He thought of his own future, a long, gray procession of years in a prison cell. He had sacrificed everything. Then Davies delivered the final, most devastating blow. "There's one more thing you should know, Alistair," he said, his voice dropping lower, almost to a whisper. "We did a thorough check. The KGB has no influence over the National Health Service. None whatsoever. Orlov's threats against your son, the manufactured incident at the hospital, the talk of a transfer to Rampton. It was all a complete and utter bluff. They couldn't have touched him. They preyed on your fear, your love for him. That was the real weapon. Not their influence, but your own mind." The room went silent, save for the incessant hum of the light above. Alistair stared at Davies, but he didn't see him. He saw the blue chalk mark on the postbox. He saw the photograph of Thomas in the pub. He saw the hollowed-out book, the Minox camera, the red glow of his cellar darkroom. He saw every single step on his road to ruin. And he saw that it had all been for nothing. He had walked into a prison of his own making, built from a love they had twisted into a weapon and a fear they had nurtured in the dark. He had betrayed his country not to save his son, but to save him from a shadow, a ghost conjured by his enemies, given power by his own heart. The real tragedy was not that he had been caught. It was that he had never needed to run in the first place. The door opened, and the two grim-faced men stepped inside. It was time to go. As they led him down the corridor, Alistair Finch, the brilliant scientist, the loving father, the unwilling spy, felt nothing at all. The frantic starling in his chest was finally still. The cage was broken, but the bird had not flown. It had simply fallen to the floor, a small, silent heap of feathers and bone. Its song extinguished forever. The Cold War had claimed many victims, but some of the deepest wounds were not inflicted by bullets or bombs, but by whispers in quiet rooms and the terrible, silent weight of a father's love.